Welcome to the latest episode of FoodTech Stories. I'm your host, FoodTech marketing expert Megan Thomas. FoodTech Stories features the leaders pioneering new approaches to technology, collaboration, and storytelling in the food tech and ag tech space. Food and agriculture are changing, and fresh ideas and leadership are needed to sustainably feed the growing global population. Join us every other week as we talk to a founder, operator, or visionary in food and agriculture. My guest today is Eric Schulze, PhD, who is founder and CEO of Good Humans, a firm that is using biotechnology to feed billions of people in a climate-changing world. Welcome to the podcast, Eric.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Well, let's dive right in. How did you come to work in the food tech sector?
The simplest answer is Reddit. I wish it was more complicated than that, but it's Reddit. The longer answer, I grew up in a family where food was very important. I grew up cooking. My mom's a baker and an artist, and I did not know what I wanted to be when I grew up. I'm a first generation college graduate in my family. I went to school on an athletic scholarship and an academic scholarship. I played college basketball, realized that wasn't going to be a life for me, but I loved science and art, and I realized they were kind of the same thing. It's creating something that didn't exist. And realized I'll just study science in college because I could always become a teacher. Long story short, fell in love with science and the process of science, and then went down that road for many years. The short version is while I was working in the U.S. government, specifically the FDA, regulating novel foods and drugs, I saw a Reddit post about this whole newfangled technology about how to grow food in effectively 3D printers and cultivation systems. And I was like, that's super cool. They're going to need a lot of help. I should join. I should figure out how to do that with them. That led me to then Memphis Meats and Upside Foods.
Let's talk about your career as a regulator with FDA first. What did you take away from that experience now that you work in industry?
Not a lot of people go work for the U.S. government and then leave willingly. It's a great job. It's a great, stable career. You get to work with really smart people and do things that matter. Some of the smartest people I've worked with were government employees. You're working with veterinarians, medical doctors, scientists of all disciplines, toxicologists. You realize that your work matters. The difference is though, of course, you give up your individual part of your work for the collective good. You don't own your work. You own the quality of your work. It taught me how to be comfortable walking away from research streams or particular lines of inquiry or even enterprise goals and not take it personally. Your science actually matters, and the people that have typically the most influence on a technical decision in this country have no technical background, are usually lawyers. You could have a coalition of 30 world's best scientists recommending something, that we do something for various technical reasons, and one lawyer can just overturn that entire decision. And that taught me that science and the law also have an important role, and that very directly led to my work in regulation and policy in the cultivated and alt protein space. I deeply encourage all scientists to do a tour of duty in the federal government. Being a scientist for others is not a skill everyone gets to have, and it gives you a sense of empathy and emotional intelligence that you otherwise wouldn't have for any other career or career path you choose. I think it makes you a much better scientist if you go work in public service. If you are seriously considering a career in science, one of those should be a civil service position.
What role do you think scientists have to play in communicating advances from a kind of a macro level around science or, say, an emerging technology, or just kind of in those everyday conversations?
We have arguably the most important role in science communication, data and information storytelling. The way data make you feel and the way you interpret those data, I used to give lectures on how we subconsciously as scientists brand our data when we present it. And it's not for malicious intent. You have to meet your audience where they are. I did an interdisciplinary PhD, a first at the time. I focused on embryonic stem cell biology, which at the time had just come out of the Bush era ban. It was very controversial, and as many people would come to my lectures as would not, that absolutely hated what I did for a living. And so I learned that it was quite important to address those concerns head on. And you can't communicate people with jargon to win them to your side, basically. I also, for a long time in DC and others, would work with federal agencies, and I created a company out there that existed for 5 years that pioneered techniques in science communication because I felt there was a hole that needed to be filled. My father's a journalist and works in broadcast communication, so I grew up around someone professionally communicating. And I tried to blend that in. You can use science to be entertaining and educational at the same time. Together with a couple of my friends, we tried different things. One of the things that's become more and more important with scientists now is you'll see them a lot more savvy to how they communicate. But also, there is an increasing gap between those that understand the science and those that use it and benefit from every day and are actively anti-scientific in maybe their beliefs. And I don't know that anyone solved that particular issue.
Why do you think that gap has emerged?
If you ask them to explain how their smartphone worked, which is a de facto supercomputer from just 20 years ago, 30 years ago, in terms of processing power, their explanations would be 2 steps above it's magic.
It isn't magic, Eric.
No, surprisingly not. Carl Sagan predicted this in The Demon Haunted World in 1994, whenever he wrote that. We are increasingly benefiting from the exponential advance in knowledge and technology, and we are further and further distancing ourselves from our understanding of it from the people that use it every day. The cyclical nature, I'll say, of the derision of expertise and elitism that's associated with that. To become a professional scientist, you have to spend a lot of time in school. As we go up our educational ladder, we often forget what it takes to understand even the basic stuff and take that for granted. And then we're not good at explaining it, or we inadvertently mock people for not understanding things. Part of it is on us. Then, of course, part of it's just a distrust of people that tell you what to do, that don't have the time to explain the rationale and all of the evidence behind that particular position. And so you just go, no, well, I just don't need to trust you. And I think that's raised its head most pertinently in like public health, for public health issues.
We did a recent episode on misinformation and disinformation with a registered dietitian and an agronomist, and they're also educators and communicators. And so thinking about misinformation in particular and how there is this growing skepticism of the expert, the way you just elucidated that was very, very enlightening. So very much appreciated. How do you think scientists can combat that? How can they adapt?
People don't feel like they know scientists. We are human beings. We are subject to the whimsy of humanity just like anyone else. We are in your communities. We are just people. We're your neighbors. There's a dissociation from like the benefit of the technology and the person that did it as a human. At most, and this was 15 years ago, 25% of the population in the United States said they could personally say, I know a scientist. That's probably gone down since then too. People just don't know scientists. They know of them, but they are not humanized to most people.
One of the areas in working in agriculture and food is only 1% to 2% of Americans work in farming or forestry. So most people really don't know a farmer and they have no idea how their food is grown. It's magic. And just how much we lose in losing kind of those connections that we once had. I want to talk about emerging food technology, which is an area you work in, of course, as well. And there tends to be a lot of fear and misinformation swirling around different types of new food technologies. Did you find this to be the case when you were at Upside Foods?
I wish I could tell you how much money I spent dealing with the pushback, the residual that existed once this industry just existed as a nascent, just born industry from the previous alternative protein industries. It was the most important thing I dealt with on a daily basis was pushing back against fraudulent, misinformed, disinformed claims. Me and my team were very successful at this because we would go to speak with farmers and ranchers who were opposed to our technologies. We would speak directly to them. We would join their cattle calls and talk with them and talk to the ranchers directly. I would give public talks where ranchers could attend. I would go to ranching and production conventions and ask to speak to all of them directly and let them dogpile me with questions. Follow up, the action. So when we would get constructive criticism, we'd take action. Uma Valetti, the founder and CEO of Upside, and myself would go meet with them and go, hey, we thought about what you said. We have a compromise. What do you think if we just change this? And we would get deals done by finding common ground. So I think we did a pretty good job. I will say if there could have been a difference, cultivated meat has paid a dear price for the language and chosen rhetoric of the plant-based meat alternative community. There was a lot of association by default from policymakers and Congress that just assumed cultivated believed the same exact things that plant-based did and believed in the same rhetoric of like, you're a bad person, basically, if you don't eat our products. That was what I would hear behind closed doors all the time on the Hill and from stakeholders and policymakers and government officials at every level. And they'd just be like, we just thought you would hate us. We thought you want to push us out. We were like, no, no, no. We are an and, not an or solution. We just want to compete on market. We just want to get on market. And then if your product's better, it wins. What had been done was quite a bit of damage. The messaging up to that point had been like, you need to convert to our way of viewing the climate changing world or else. That really put a lot of potential allies on the back heel and set us back probably a good 5-10 years.
I actually launched a line of plant-based protein products in a legacy meat company. Consumers were coming to plant-based foods, and they were, especially meat alternatives, dairy alternatives, specifically meat, that they were looking for variety, versatility, health benefits, which products didn't always deliver on. You had a handful who talked about sustainability or animal welfare, but just a handful. It was single digits. Somehow there was that sense from the folks who wanted to commercialize these products that it needed to be that lifestyle choice. You need to become a flexitarian or a vegetarian or a vegan. To your point, it didn't work, but it also flew in the face of the actual, what we knew about the consumer who actually wanted more choice.
It's real simple. Consumers want, is it available? What does it cost?
Yeah, good value.
Would I feed this to my family? Does it taste good? But then the last one, and I think this is the presumption and foundation, is it safe? None of those are like, it's great for the planet. Those externalities can be baked into a product.
Or at the brand level.
Plant-based has figured this out. They've gone, oh, wait a second. The climate aspect isn't as important. It's a benefit of just buying our products. But we're not going to, like, even Impossible, I think, has moved to like red packaging to be more in line with like meat and fast food colors in their branding and moved away from green. I think that's a great move. I'm really happy that they've kind of moved into we're just a good product and we hope you buy it. We have a better product than what's out there. Hopefully we're cheaper than conventional meat at some point. That has been an uphill battle for years that I inherited basically. But I think I undid a lot of damage and just flipped the script with my team on the approach needs to be partnership, compromise, and bipartisanship where we can.
Absolutely. And I think really listening, that part is forgotten. Certain firms, individuals lost sight of the consumer and kind of what the consumer really wanted in any field. I'm just talking about the technology that you can lose sight and stop listening. And I think to build on your experience with cultivated meat is that working in CRISPR food, which was emerging versus GMO, every conversation started with, well, how are you going to avoid the problems of GMO? Could have been with a national news reporter. It could have been with your neighbor. It could have been with a potential partner, board member, anyone. It was presumed no one wants GMO foods, which is fundamentally untrue, and that everyone thinks the same way about it. CRISPR must be exactly the same, even though decades later, different technology, different time, different problems, different products. What was fascinating to me was that folks would just accept what they thought to be true as true. So we had to kind of get to that deeper conversation, which is, let's actually talk about what we actually know about this. And sure, we want to learn from the past, but let's not assume that things are static. It's really, really interesting to think about that. Is that something that was relevant to you during your time at Upside?
Yeah. And even going back to FDA, because I regulated novel foods. They didn't have a novel foods program, but they knew emerging biotechnology that would be used for food. And it was genetic engineering. It was genetically engineered animals. That was the hot thing before Cultivated. I watched the same thing happen back then, too. People were more tolerant of a genetically engineered cow, goat, chicken, whatever, for food than they were for genetically engineered crops or genetically engineered cells. At the time didn't really exist, but the acceptance at that time is incredibly high because people were like, for some reason, cool with the fact that like their meat might be cheaper. People just want to pay less and they don't want to give up their lifestyle. They don't want to change. And I totally get it as a reluctant meat eater. I am very motivated because I know the damage I'm doing. I also know that I'm never going to fully give up meat, being a good Texan who loves his barbecue. What can I do to accelerate the adoption of alternative proteins and other emerging biotechnologies too, that would ensure people don't have to change their behaviors and they can just keep eating the meat they like? I think another thing is people perceived the discussion around like, you're forcing me to switch to plants. I don't want to be forced to switch to plants. But you're telling me it tastes like meat, but I don't think it tastes exactly like meat. People have to opt into these changes, I think, if they're going to be really successful.
Form and format of our foods is so important. Crossing the chasm to creating new products that are truly new forms and formats proves elusive, or at least we've been focusing on it's a burger patty, it's a hot dog, it's a glass of milk. Do you see potential for new forms and formats, or is that not something people want?
The strategy I developed at Upside, it's a two-phase strategy for Cultivated, like cultural adoption, which was one, encapsulated with a statement of focusing on what meat is. Phase two is focusing on what meat can be. Everything was about replicating familiar favorites, making familiar favorite foods. That's part of the reason we chose chicken and like doing nuggets and breast fillets and like things that people eat commonly and are not high class per se, were just food that people that I would buy every day. Down the road was like build trust with consumers with those products, and plant-based did the same thing, by the way, very familiar formats. Is then down the road, we've only explored less than what is like 1% of the total animal population on the planet in terms of species we eat because they were domesticatable. There's a lot of potential animal cells that we could eat that might be the best tasting thing we've ever eaten, but we wouldn't because you couldn't grow them. I also think that there's like formats to the meat that we've never explored, and most importantly, synthetic or designed meat products, where we start with genetic meat architecture, living cell, and we modify the cell to become whatever we need it to be. Maybe it started its life genetically as a chicken and it produces great meat. We then can strip out or change things genetically and it can produce indistinguishable meat like cow's meat, for example, beef. There's no reason we can't use genetic architecture and training to like produce new species. So I think that's where we need to go, but we haven't even earned consumer trust on the first generation of products. That's TBD.
And do you think these technologies, if you were placing a bet, do you think it will benefit folks with disposable income or just for a time until these products become more cost effective to produce and sell?
This is the debate that's happening right now in the cultivated space is, can these products ever achieve a price point where it would undercut conventional products? Or were they always going to be sort of a luxury purchase or a premium purchase? That's the big what if. I believe the evidence supports getting to cost competitiveness with conventional products. We're not there yet. Practically speaking, they are just going to be just like the plant-based. They're going to be priced premium initially until we figure out how to make them more effectively. The food industry scale is unfathomably large. Most people don't realize what it takes, how large these operations are. Like a medium-sized meat processing facility in Kansas is doing up to 1 million pounds of meat every week. And that is a relatively low number in the meat industry. The largest commercial cultivated facility that's been proposed is somewhere on the order of like 15 to 20 million pounds per year. And when a company can do that in a quarter or 6 weeks, that is a large amount of everything. To do that, by the way, to feed an entire city, say San Francisco, a cultivated burger every day would use up the entire world's supply of amino acids in about 3 weeks. You also have to build the products and the supply chain. That also has to exist and like be more mature as well.
And I think that's part of why it's so difficult to commercialize these technologies, right? Because the cost involved to get to scale and to go up against well-established, well-funded existing industries that have figured things out over decades and decades and centuries of doing the work and having those distribution relationships and all of that. What's your outlook for cultivated meat in the US in years to come?
As a professional scientist, I'm optimistic. As an executive and an entrepreneur, I'm even more optimistic. And I'm not saying this to be sort of delusional. When you look at development cycles for historically, right now, cultivated meat is following the exact same innovation path in terms of patents and publications and products that the CRISPR-Cas9 system was following, albeit 10 years out of phase. We are on the same curve, effectively. And we are in the trough of disillusionment right now. We are in the, well, it's not working the way we wanted to. We're not going to get, our investors aren't going to get their returns as fast as they wanted. It's a lot harder to scale than we thought it would be. These are all not all predictable potential outcomes. Someone's going to figure out how to do this at a reasonable scale. Then someone's going to innovate and figure out an even better way that's going to make that scaling easier and larger. And then we're going to be back on to another space race in this space. I think it will probably coincidentally coincide with a disillusionment with AI-based products because code is cheap and typically investors will avoid biology and go into something with a higher return, which is code. It's faster. Biology, they come back to biology every 10 years to invest in it when they decide it's worth their time again. Ultimately, going to succeed. It's going to be a few companies. I don't think it's going to be all of them. I want it to be a lot of them, but I don't think it will be. The ones that do survive are going to inspire a new generation of companies that want to improve on it. And I think then we're off to the races again.
So you heard it here on Food Tech Stories, Eric's outlook for cultivated meat. I think that's very thoughtful, and I'm interested to hear or see what actually happens in the future. No one has a crystal ball, but it very well could happen.
I will add, there's one thing that I think if it could increase the chances by like doubling or tripling, I think the single thing that could happen tomorrow that would make sure this likely happens is formal government investment in the space through federal loan guarantees, programs like the Department of Energy did for electrification of the vehicle supply, transportation. That is the largest vote of confidence because then venture capital doesn't have to put the bets and pay for the steel in the ground and the infrastructure, which they don't want to do anyway. And the government can get behind it. And then I think that's the number one thing that could happen that would turn the tide. I think that's true for alternative proteins in general. It would be fungus or plant-based too.
In the US, we've gotten very siloed and we think about this is venture funded, the government can do this. There's such an opportunity to connect the dots and work more broadly across these different sectors. We'll see if that happens. Let's turn to the work you're doing at your firm, Good Humans. What is your vision for your firm?
The Good Humans work is focused almost exclusively on finding and working with teams and people, policymakers, basically building coalitions through the private sector that can fund and mature technologies that are going to feed billions of people in a climate changing world. That could be cultivated meat, that can be plant-based, that can be things we haven't thought of yet, and it can also include biopharmaceuticals. It takes an integrated approach. And like my background in my team specifically, like I'm not just a scientist and an interdisciplinary one at that, I know how to build companies and as an executive, but also have a policy and regulatory background and have built policy for multiple countries on how to get new technologies through. The branding, marketing, policy, all of that has to be integrated. No one's really offering. I always thought, I wish somebody would just offer a one-stop shop for me, for my new technology. That's what we do.
Looking to the next 10 years, what are you most excited about?
My hot take, if I'm allowed to put one in here. My
Yes.
hottest take.
We always want a hot take, yes.
My hot take for you is I think we're going to see the first companies that have an agentic or AI co-founder. They're going to have a technical co-founder that is going to be a ChatGPT. Some person's going to have a great idea, but they don't know how to execute it technically. And there's enough information that you could ask enough questions that you would have an agentic helper. That's my hot take, that we will start seeing human AI company foundings for particular products. And I am super excited to see how that plays out, candidly, because we're at PhD level supposedly for some of these. So that wouldn't surprise me, I guess, but that's my hot take.
And you wouldn't have to give them equity.
Well, that's a whole other podcast about their rights and responsibilities, which I am thoroughly unqualified to talk about. From like just a food perspective, well, first off, I think we're going to see the first cultivated get to scale, one or two of them. It's like a sort of nationwide or global product that becomes sort of the Impossible Burger or the Beyond Burger version. My hope is we see the next, what's going to try to compete with cultivated. Right now, cultivated doesn't have competition. Its competition is itself, basically. I would love to see technologies begin a healthy competition with it. And I don't know what that technology is. Is it a genetically engineered animal? Is that the way it is? Is it a brand new species? Is it using a new synthetic biology tool? I don't know, but that would be very cool to see. And then my third, I think that we will see a blurring of the food and pharma production systems. We are now going into massive fermentation systems that we can produce equally as well and cheaply. We can produce pharmaceuticals cheaper than we could now with the learnings of cultivated. And we can produce better cultivated products with the learnings we're gaining from pharmaceutical and precision fermentation industries. I think that you're going to start seeing a blurring of those lines too in terms of products. The example would be like you're using a cow cell to make Humira, and then you sell the meat at the end.
Outstanding. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. It was great.
Thanks for joining us today on the latest episode of Food Tech Stories. Be sure and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and keep an eye out for our bi-weekly episodes. I'm your host, Megan Thomas, founder of Ladris 17. Food Tech Stories is edited by TJG Media.